about the idea of archive and the idea of memory and the idea of the city. And I wanted to talk rather practically about how these three terms exist within a gallery space and how they're interacted with an audience and how artists deal with them as well. So I should also start by saying that the idea of an archive has been a subject of much debate over the past 3 decades. Both theoretically, the theoretical discourse has really expanded greatly over the past 3 decades, but also in terms of an art historical context, artists engaging with archives has really changed over the past few decades. And personally, I really think this expansion and interaction with the archive is a really interesting thing, and the different things that it takes on, the more diverse it becomes, the better it is for art practice, I think. So I'm going to talk very specifically about 3 examples, starting with an example of an artist creating an archive. So Susan Meiselas is a Magnum photographer. She is a very well-known figure in the United States and probably internationally. And in 1991, she started working on a project called Kurdistan, which she worked on for over 6 years. And she went to the Kurdish region of Iraq in 1991, and she began documenting just everyday activities, starting with conflict, but then getting to know the cities and the villages that she was visiting. And when she went there, she had no prior knowledge of Kurdish history, and over the period of time, she wanted to do research into the Kurdish people, but she found that none of this history was available. So that's when she began gathering and collecting information in order to build a visual history, a photographic history of the Kurdish people. And this project, this 6-year project, exists in 4 different, four different areas. Firstly, it exists through her documentary practice, so her personal work, which this is one of her photographs. And what's very interesting about Susan's work is her documentary images from the 90s in this case, physically include archival material from a much earlier period. So in her practice, she purposely inputs historical artifacts within the present. So here we're looking at an image that she took in 1991, and in the image you can see a photograph from the 1960s, and now we're looking at it in 2014. So there's these different levels of time that she's working with, which time is something that's related to photography and the archive in general, so she plays with this a lot in her work. The project also exists as an exhibition, so including her own documentary practice and other photographic imagery which is collected and archival material about Kurdish history. She published a book in 1997, In the Shadow of History, which up until that point was all of the information that she'd gathered, so visual documentation, photographs and text. And the project also exists as a website, which can be added to and has been added to over periods of time. So the way that why I use this as an example to start with is the way that this one project deals with it deals with 4 different ways of looking at archival practice. There's documentary practice, there's the website, the book, and the historic imagery. And these are very common ways which artists interact with archives. But what's, I guess, the main example of Meiselas' work is how a lot of contemporary artists engage with archives that already exist. But in Meiselas' case, the archive didn't exist, so she was creating it at the same time as engaging with it. And I just wanted to mention briefly, I don't know much about this project, but following on from Meiselas' Kurdistan website, there is this website called, I don't know how to pronounce it, Hushamangan, which is an online directory of images of Ottoman Armenian cities and villages. And this is an ongoing project that can be interacted with and added to. And I guess why I wanted to mention this was the idea of the interaction and engagement with different audiences. So secondly, I wanted to talk about how archival projects, how audiences engage with archival projects. So I think in 2011 at SALT, the Contemporary Art Space in Istanbul, there was an exhibition of the professional studio archive of a photographer called Mariam Shahinyan. And she was a studio photographer from 1935 to 1985, so over a 50-year period, unintentionally documented the changing cultural and political landscape of Istanbul, of a certain area of Istanbul. And the archive was then digitized, and there was an exhibition in Istanbul, and one of the learning events based around the exhibition was that the audience was invited to tag some of the images. So if you recognized a family member or a friend, you would tag them in this archival database. So this was a way that the curators were trying to get the local community to engage with the 80-year recent history in Istanbul. But at the same time, there was a parallel exhibition, not parallel in the sense that it was connected, but parallel in the sense that it was running at the same time, of work by Firas Sarkisyan, a work called History, where he photographed the closed Ottoman archives in Istanbul.
Can you repeat the name?
Of the project, it was called History.
So, history.
His
Sitting behind you.
I shouldn't talk about those. Yes. But so in the same city, there was two exhibitions at the same time. One which was pointing to the fact that there is this Ottoman history which can't be activated and can't be engaged with. But then another exhibition which is actively inviting the audience to engage with a more recent history. And I guess from a curatorial perspective, it's a very clever thing to do, but maybe unintentional. I don't know. Curators do a lot of things that happen out of circumstance that aren't really intentional. So that project was it. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the idea of archives as private collections. So we're in London at the moment, and in London there is one of the biggest private collections of archival photography. It's called the Archive of Modern Conflict. They have over 4 million photographs. They're first and foremost a collection, but they also engage in curatorial practices, and they also have their own publishing company. So it's very funny the way they engage with, they collect globally. They started by collecting just things related to conflict, but now they collect on a much more wider scale. And this is an exhibition that they curated at Paris Photo in 2012, I think. And as you can see, they showed around 150 photographs in this salon hang, ranging from 1850 to 2010. So a really large scope in terms of time, but also a really large scope in terms of subject and geography. And I'm working with them on a project which will open at the end of the year, where I've been to the archive and seen images that relate to Ottoman history, but they're totally out of context. So they do this thing where they flatten out time and space and history by having a massive archive of images curated rather arbitrarily and without any kind of interpretation. And I guess the way that artists and academics think so carefully about curating and the ideas of memory and history and the city. And then you have a private collection like the Archive of Modern Conflict that actually abandons all of that in a very forward way. It's never their intention to make those things relevant. And this is the kind of things in the collection. So hundreds of albums. And then finally, I just wanted to end by going back to the theme of the city and the history of the city. So in 2001, there was an exhibition called Century City at Tate Modern, and it looked at 9 international cities that at various points throughout the 20th century had been of cultural significance. And looking back at this list now, considering the way the art world has changed and the way that the Middle East has become much more prevalent in contemporary art practice, it seems rather strange that there is no city from the Middle East in this list. And it just got me thinking that if you're going to pick an Ottoman city, which city would it be and what time period would that be from?